If your holiday traditions don't involve beating a log until it defecates or eating toxic birds buried in seal fat, you are doing it wrong. History's version of Christmas is a chaotic nightmare of radioactive decorations, gluttonous kings, and home-invading skeletons. We are diving into the 33 weirdest, dumbest, and most dangerous festive facts that will permanently ruin your view of the holidays. Let's get weird. 1. If you think finding a lump of coal in your stocking is harsh, you have clearly never spent the holidays in Catalonia, where the most beloved festive icon is literally a pooping log. Known as Tio de Nadal, this tradition involves taking a hollow log, painting a smiling face on it, and giving it two little stick legs so it looks vaguely alive. For weeks leading up to the big day, children are tasked with keeping the log warm under a blanket and feeding it nuts and dried fruit every single night to fatten it up. Then, on Christmas Eve, the love turns to violence. The kids grab heavy sticks and savagely beat the log while singing a traditional song that explicitly commands it to defecate presents. If the log doesn't poop out enough candies or nougat, the lyrics threaten to hit it even harder. It is the only holiday tradition on Earth that successfully combines animal husbandry, domestic violence, and digestion into one heartwarming family event. 2. We all dream of a white Christmas, but in the early 20th century, that magical winter aesthetic came with a severe side of terminal lung disease. Before we understood that certain minerals were deadly, people were obsessed with bringing snow inside their houses, but since real snow melts and ruins the carpet, manufacturers sold artificial snow under names like white magic. The problem was that this fluffy white powder was made of 100% industrial-grade asbestos. It was marketed as fireproof and safe, so families happily sprinkled pure carcinogens all over their Christmas trees, wreaths, and living rooms, effectively hotboxing their children with hazardous materials. It wasn't just in homes either. That famous scene in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy falls asleep in a poppy field while snow gently falls? That was chrysotile asbestos. Fibers raining down on the cast. So when you watch that movie and feel the holiday nostalgia, just remember that Judy Garland was essentially inhaling a construction site hazard for the sake of cinema. 3. Have you ever wondered why Santa's reindeer can fly? The answer might not be magic, but rather a massive dose of hallucinogenic drugs. In the Arctic Circle, the indigenous Sami people noticed that local reindeer had a very specific dietary obsession with Amanita muscaria, those iconic red and white toadstools that are incredibly toxic and psychoactive. After munching on these fungi, the reindeer would start prancing around, twitching, and acting erratic, almost as if they were high as a kite and flying. The local shamans wanted to achieve that same spiritual trip, but the mushrooms were poisonous to humans in their raw form. However, the reindeer's digestive system filtered out the deadly toxins while keeping the psychoactive chemicals intact in their urine. So the shamans would collect the yellow snow or catch the reindeer pee and drink it to go on a spiritual journey. Under the influence of this recycled psychedelic cocktail, they often reported the sensation of flying or their souls leaving their bodies, giving birth to the legend of the flying sleigh. 4. In most parts of the world, Christmas dinner involves a turkey, a ham, or maybe a roast goose. But in Japan, the traditional Christmas Eve meal is a greasy bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. This creates a nationwide frenzy where millions of Japanese families wait in lines that can last for hours, or they have to order their party barrels months in advance just to secure a meal. This unique tradition started in 1974, thanks to a brilliantly deceptive marketing campaign called Kentucky for Christmas. The manager of the first KFC in Japan heard foreigners looking for turkey and realizing it was impossible to find. So he lied to the Japanese public and told them that fried chicken was the standard American Christmas dinner. It was a complete fabrication, but it worked perfectly. Today, Colonel Sanders' statues outside Japanese outlets are dressed in Santa suits. And for millions of people, nothing says the birth of Jesus quite like secret herbs and spices. 5. If you have a weak stomach, you might want to skip this one because the Greenlandic Inuit tradition of kiviak makes fruitcake look like a Michelin star dessert. This is a winter delicacy reserved for festive occasions like Christmas, and the recipe reads like a horror movie script. To make it, You take a seal skin and stuff it with about 500 little seabirds called auks. You do not clean the birds, you do not pluck the feathers, and you certainly do not remove the beaks or feet. You shove them in whole, sew the sealskin shut, and seal it with grease to keep the air out. Then, you bury this massive meat sack under a heavy rock for several months to let it ferment into a soft, decomposed mush. When Christmas rolls around, you dig it up, bite the bird's head off, and suck out the fermented juices. It smells like a mix of strong blue cheese and rotting flesh, proving that people will eat literally anything to survive the winter. 6. The Welsh have a Christmas tradition that is undeniably cooler and infinitely more terrifying than standard caroling, known as the Mari Lwyd. Instead of cute kids singing songs, a group of villagers finds a real horse skull, mounts it on a wooden pole, and attaches a white sheet to hide the person holding it. They often rigged the jaw with a spring so it could snap shut with a loud crack, creating a skeletal nightmare puppet. This squad would walk through the dark streets, knock on someone's door, and challenge the homeowner to a battle of wits called a panco. This is essentially a medieval rap battle where the horse skull insults you in rhyme, and you have to rhyme back an insult or an excuse for why they cannot come in. If you lose the rap battle to the dead horse, you have to let the creature and its entourage into your house to eat your food and drink your beer. It is effectively a home invasion, but with more poetry and skeletons. 7. Before plastic took over the world, Christmas decorations were a heavy metal affair, literally. From the Victorian era all the way up until the early 1970s, that shiny silver tinsel you draped over the tree was made from real lead. It was incredibly popular because it didn't tarnish like silver and it hung beautifully due to the weight, making the tree look spectacular. The downside, of course, was that families were covering their living rooms in a potent neurotoxin every single December. Children would handle the tinsel and then put their fingers in their mouths. Or the family dog would chew on a strand, leading to gradual lead poisoning just from trying to be festive. It took decades for health officials to realize that maybe, just maybe, wrapping the symbol of joy and life in a heavy metal that causes brain damage wasn't the best idea. The FDA finally convinced manufacturers to stop producing lead tinsel in 1972, ending a long tradition of toxic holiday cheer. 8. In colonial America, specifically in the 1700s, there was no greater flex than owning a pineapple, which served as the ultimate status symbol rather than a snack. These tropical fruits were incredibly hard to import before refrigeration, often rotting on the ship before they arrived, so a single pineapple could cost the equivalent of $8,000 in today's money. Because they were so obscenely expensive, eating one was out of the question for almost everyone, so people would use them as the centerpiece for their Christmas dinner to show off their immense wealth. But what if you wanted to look rich but couldn't afford the fruit? You could literally rent a pineapple for the night. You would pay a fee to a shopkeeper, take the pineapple home, put it on your table so your guests would be jealous, and then return it the next day so the shopkeeper could rent it to another social climber. If you actually sliced it up and ate it, you were either royalty or completely insane. 9. In the American South during the 18th and 19th centuries, fireworks were scarce and expensive, so the locals developed a terrifyingly dangerous tradition known as firing the anvil. Instead of lighting a sparkler, they would take a massive blacksmith's anvil, fill its cavity with black gunpowder, and place a second iron anvil upside down on top of it to act as a seal. They would then light a fuse and run for their lives. When the powder ignited, the explosion was so violent that it would launch the top anvil, which weighed over 100 pounds, hundreds of feet into the air. It was basically a homemade cannon that shot heavy industrial equipment into the sky, and quite often, it would come crashing down on spectators or houses. It is the ultimate example of hold my beer history, proving that rednecks have been blowing things up for entertainment long before YouTube existed. 10. If you complain about the smell of cooking turkey, spare a thought for families in Poland and the Czech Republic, where the traditional Christmas centerpiece is a carp that lives in your bathroom. Because these fish taste best when fresh, families buy the carp alive days before Christmas and keep it swimming in the family bathtub to purge the mud from its system. This means that for the entire week leading up to the holidays, No one in the house can take a shower or a bath because the tub is occupied by a slimy, bottom-feeding fish. The children often name the fish and treat it like a temporary pet, only to watch their father murder it with a mallet on Christmas Eve. It creates a delightful mix of poor hygiene and childhood trauma that really brings the family together. 11. Before the Pennsylvania Dutch adopted the friendly image of Santa Claus, they had Belsnickel, who is essentially Santa's evil, bipolar cousin. Dressed in dirty furs and tattered clothes, Belsnickel didn't come down the chimney. He tapped on the windows with a stick to scare the living daylights out of the children inside. Once he entered the house, he would quiz the kids on their behavior, and if they had been bad, he didn't just give them coal. He physically whipped them with a switch he carried in his hand. But the psychological warfare didn't stop there. He would then throw candy on the floor, and if the children dove for it too eagerly, he would whip them again for being greedy. He was less of a gift giver and more of a home-invading disciplinarian who taught kids that holiday joy comes with a side of corporal punishment. 12. We all know Christmas crackers as those cardboard tubes that make a small pop and contain a terrible joke and a paper hat. But their invention was literally fueled by explosives. In the 1840s, a London confectioner named Tom Smith tried to sell French-style bonbons, but nobody was interested until he was inspired by the crackle of a log in a fireplace. He decided the sweets needed an element of danger to be exciting, so he added a friction strip containing silver fulminate, a legitimate explosive compound. When he launched his bangs of expectation, they were an instant hit because Victorian children apparently loved anything that sounded like a gunshot at the dinner table. It turns out that the only thing missing from the holiday dinner was a chemically induced explosion to startle Grandma, proving that pyrotechnics are the key to marketing success. 13. You might think the Grinch hated Christmas, but he has nothing on the country of Scotland, which effectively banned the holiday for nearly 4 centuries. Following the Protestant Reformation in 1560, the Scottish Kirk decided that Christmas was too Catholic and too fun, so they legally cancelled it. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was a criminal offense to be seen celebrating. If you were caught baking a festive mince pie, you could be threatened with imprisonment. For hundreds of years, December 25th was just a normal working day where people went to the office or the factory as if nothing was happening. Amazingly, Christmas did not become a designated public holiday in Scotland again until 1958. That means there are people alive today who remember a time when the entire country just ignored the biggest holiday on earth out of sheer stubborn religious principle. 14. The Victorians are famous for their polite society, but their Christmas parlor games were basically sanctioned torture, and the worst offender was a game called Hot Cockles. In this brutal pastime, one unlucky person was blindfolded and forced to kneel down with their head in someone's lap. The other guests would then take turns kicking or slapping the victim from behind as hard as they could. The kneeling victim then had to guess who hit them, and they couldn't stand up until they guessed correctly. If they guessed wrong, they just kept getting beaten by their friends and family. It was less of a game and more of a way to legally assault your relatives under the guise of festive cheer. It really makes a boring game of Monopoly with your grandmother look pretty good by comparison. 15. Finding the perfect gift is hard, but in 1252, King Henry III received a present that was impossible to wrap: a live polar bear. The bear was a gift from King Haakon of Norway and was kept in the Tower of London, which served as the royal menagerie. Since keeping a polar bear fed is expensive and Henry was cheap, the king came up with a unique solution. He ordered a long, heavy iron chain to be attached to the bear's neck and allowed the animal to swim in the River Thames to catch its own fish. Londoners would gather on the banks to watch a literal polar bear paddling around the dirty river in the middle of the city. It was a surreal spectacle that likely terrified anyone trying to row a boat nearby, turning the Thames into the most dangerous swimming pool in medieval Europe. 16. Every nativity play you have ever seen features 3 wise men arriving at the stable, but if you actually read the Bible, it never says there were 3 of them. The Gospel of Matthew simply states that wise men from the east arrived and they brought 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Because there were 3 items, tradition just assumed there were 3 guys, but for all we know, it could have been 2 guys carrying heavy bags, or a party of 20 people chipping in for the gifts. Some Eastern traditions even claim there were 12 magi. The idea of "we 3 kings" is basically historical fan fiction that we all just accepted as fact, proving that we have been counting the guests at the birthday party wrong for 2,000 years. 17. In the Alsace region between France and Germany, Santa doesn't travel alone. He brings a sidekick named Hans Trapp, who makes Krampus look like a cuddly teddy bear. Legend says Hans was a rich, cruel knight who turned to Satanism and eventually cannibalism to satisfy his twisted cravings. After being exiled to the forest, he disguised himself as a scarecrow to hunt and eat children who wandered too close. In a bizarre twist of holiday spirit, he was eventually struck by lightning by God himself, but his spirit lives on as a Christmas companion. Now he travels with Saint Nicholas, not to give gifts, but to scare the living hell out of naughty kids. While Santa hands out chocolate, Hans Trapp stands there looking like a demonic scarecrow, reminding children that if they misbehave, the alternative to a present is being eaten by a medieval ghost. 18. Christmas of 1980 was dominated by a colorful plastic block that drove the entire human population to the brink of insanity: the Rubik's Cube. It was the absolute must-have gift of the season, selling hundreds of millions of units and creating a global obsession that parents immediately regretted. But this toy was so addictive that it actually created a new medical condition. Doctors reported a sudden surge in patients suffering from Rubik's wrist and Cuber's thumb, which were repetitive strain injuries caused by frantically twisting the cube for hours on end. It was the first time in history that a Christmas toy physically injured children, not because it was sharp or dangerous, but because they simply could not put it down. It remains the only puzzle that has caused both orthopedic damage and extreme emotional rage on Christmas morning. 19. If you think Christmas caroling is a sweet, innocent tradition, you need to look at its drunken, aggressive origins known as wassailing. In medieval England, this wasn't about spreading joy. It was basically a legalized shakedown. Mobs of peasants would roam the streets, arrive at the homes of wealthy neighbors and demand high-quality booze and food. They would sing songs that explicitly threatened the homeowner, with lyrics promising to curse the family or vandalize their property if they didn't hand over the alcohol immediately. One popular song even includes the line, "We won't go until we get some," which is less of a festive jingle and more of a hostage negotiation tactic. It was essentially trick or treat for adults, but with more cider and a legitimate threat of property damage if you were stingy. 20. The entire reason we associate Christmas with deep, fluffy snow is largely because Charles Dickens lived through a freak climate anomaly. In the early 19th century, London experienced a period known as the Little Ice Age, where temperatures plummeted so low that the River Thames froze solid enough to hold frost fairs on the ice. Dickens grew up during these rare, snowy winters, so when he wrote A Christmas Carol, he described a white winter wonderland as the norm. In reality, white Christmases in southern England are historically very rare. We have spent nearly 2 centuries chasing a holiday aesthetic that was based on a temporary climate glitch, meaning our standard for a perfect Christmas is actually just 1800s weather propaganda. 21. The city of Riga in Latvia claims to be the birthplace of the very first Christmas tree back in 1510, but their version of decorating was a bit more destructive than ours. According to the records, a group of local merchants known as the Brotherhood of Blackheads brought a fir tree into the town square, covered it with paper flowers, and danced around it. But instead of leaving it up for the season to enjoy the twinkling lights, the grand finale of the night was to set the entire tree on fire. They got drunk, danced, and watched it burn to the ground in a massive bonfire. So the original Christmas tree tradition wasn't about preservation or beauty. It was just an elaborate excuse for pyromania, which honestly sounds like a much more fun way to end a party. 22. When it comes to holiday overeating, nobody in history can compete with King Richard II of England. For his Christmas feast in 1377, the royal kitchen prepared a menu that is frankly obscene. The grocery list included 28 oxen and 300 sheep, all slaughtered and roasted for a single event. That is not a meal. That is a localized extinction event for livestock. The feast was so massive that it is cited by historians as one of the most grotesque displays of gluttony in the Middle Ages. While most peasants were lucky to get a scrap of meat, the king and his courtiers were effectively eating a medium-sized farm. If you feel guilty about having a second slice of pie this year, just remember that you didn't eat 300 sheep, so you are technically on a diet compared to royalty. 23. In Italy, the main gift-bringer isn't a jolly man in a sleigh, but an ugly old witch flying on a broomstick named La Befana. According to Italian folklore, she delivers gifts on the eve of the Epiphany in January, leaving candy for good kids and a lump of coal, or sometimes dark candy that looks like coal, for the bad ones. The story goes that the three wise men invited her to join their search for baby Jesus, but she was too busy cleaning her house and said no. She later regretted it and has been flying around the world ever since, visiting every house in hopes of finding the Holy Child. It is a charming tradition that teaches kids that if you prioritize housework over an adventure, you will turn into a witch who is doomed to wander the earth forever. 24. In certain rural communities during the 18th century, veterinary science was practically non-existent, so farmers turned to a bizarre Christmas ritual to cure their livestock. If a cow or horse fell ill around the holidays, the farmer wouldn't call a doctor. Instead, they would write a Bible verse or a prayer on a piece of paper, wrap it in dough or bread, and force the animal to eat it. The belief was that the holy words digesting inside the beast would miraculously cure the sickness. It was literally eating the scriptures. While the faith was strong, feeding ink and parchment to a cow with a stomachache probably didn't do much to help the situation, but it certainly adds a literal meaning to digesting the Word of God. 25. In 1927, the United States government decided that federal bureaucracy shouldn't stop at the edge of reality, so the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Aeronautics officially issued a legitimate pilot's license to Santa Claus. They didn't just scribble a note on a napkin. They processed formal paperwork designating him with license number 100 and even created detailed airway maps for his sleigh to ensure airworthiness. The government claimed this was done to assure anxious children that Santa would not be grounded or arrested for flying an unregistered vehicle through American airspace, effectively making Saint Nick a federally licensed aviator. It stands as a rare moment where the government played along with a collective fantasy, but it also weirdly implies that if Santa ever crashed his sleigh, the FAA would be legally required to launch a full-scale crash investigation into the reindeer propulsion system. 26. Japan has a history of hidden Christians that sounds more like a high-stakes spy thriller than a religious movement. After the shogun strictly banned Christianity in 1614, under the threat of immediate execution, believers known as Kakure Kirishitan went deep underground to keep their faith alive. For over 250 years, they managed to celebrate Christmas in total secrecy by developing clever optical illusions. They created statues that looked exactly like the Buddhist goddess Kannon holding a baby, but in their minds, they were praying to the Virgin Mary and Jesus. They essentially camouflaged their forbidden religion within the dominant culture's iconography to avoid the death penalty. This disguise was so effective that they managed to pass down these secret traditions for centuries right under the noses of the samurai authorities who wanted to kill them, proving that the spirit of Christmas is surprisingly good at stealth operations. 27. We have all heard the sweet, pious story that candy canes are shaped like a J for Jesus, and that the red stripes represent his blood. But historians confirm this is a complete myth manufactured in the 20th century. In the 1950s, a religious movement tried to keep Christ in Christmas by retroactively assigning holy meaning to the candy, but the boring reality is much more practical. Candy canes were originally invented in Germany simply as straight white sugar sticks designed to keep choir boys quiet during long, boring church services. The famous hook was added later not for theological reasons, but for a purely engineering purpose. It made the candy easier to hang on the branches of a Christmas tree without falling off. So, despite what the internet or your grandmother might tell you, the world's most famous holiday candy is a triumph of gravity-defying utility, not hidden theology. 28. If you think your relatives are difficult to please at holiday dinners, be glad you aren't dining with the legendary King Arthur. According to Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the king had a bizarre and incredibly annoying Christmas vow. He absolutely refused to sit down and eat his feast until he had seen a marvel or heard a tale of a great adventure. This meant that hundreds of hungry knights and courtiers had to stand around staring at the roasting meat while it got cold, just waiting for something dramatic to happen. Often, knights would have to rush out and desperately find a damsel in distress or a monster just to satisfy the king's need for entertainment so everyone could finally eat. It turns out King Arthur was the original dinner and a show customer, but with much higher stakes for the starving waitstaff. 29. The tradition of giving unnecessarily expensive Christmas gifts peaked with the Russian Romanov family, who turned gift-giving into an extreme sport of wealth inequality. Tsar Alexander III started a tradition of commissioning the jeweler Peter Carl Fabergé to create a jeweled Easter or Christmas egg for his wife every year. These weren't just fancy decorations. They were made of solid gold, diamonds, and rubies, often containing tiny, intricate mechanical surprises inside like miniature trains or birds. They cost the modern equivalent of millions of dollars and served absolutely no function other than sitting on a shelf looking pretty. While the Russian peasantry was literally starving outside the palace gates, the Tsar was exchanging the most expensive useless objects in human history, which might explain why the Russian Revolution eventually put a very permanent and bloody end to their holiday shopping spree. 30. Today we associate ghost stories exclusively with Halloween, but for centuries Christmas Eve was actually the prime time for absolute terror. In the Victorian era, it was traditional to gather around the fire not to sing happy carols, but to tell spine-chilling stories of the undead and the supernatural. This is exactly why Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol as a ghost story, and why Henry James wrote the terrified classic The Turn of the Screw as a holiday tale. The idea was that as the nights were at their longest and darkest in December, the barrier between the living and the dead was thinnest. We have largely sanitized this tradition into holly jolly cheer, but originally the holidays were Spooky Season Part 2, designed to scare you into being a virtuous person before the new year arrived. 31. For the die-hard science nerds out there, December 25th marks the birth of a different kind of savior. While the world celebrates the Nativity, the physics community quietly observes Newtonmas, because Sir Isaac Newton was actually born on Christmas Day in 1642, according to the old Julian calendar. It is a fantastic historical coincidence that the man who illuminated the laws of the universe was born on the same day we celebrate the light of the world. Some atheists and scientists actually exchange apples or cards celebrating gravity on this day to honor him. So, if you forget to buy a gift for someone, just drop an apple on their head and tell them you are celebrating the birth of modern physics. It is technically historically accurate and saves you a lot of money on wrapping paper. 32. We take instant messaging for granted today, sending billions of texts every hour without thinking. But the entire global texting revolution began with a single holiday greeting. The very first SMS in human history was sent on December 3, 1992, by a British engineer named Neil Papworth. He sent it from a massive desktop computer to the clunky, brick-sized Orbitel 901 mobile phone of Vodafone director Richard Jarvis. The message didn't contain any emojis, abbreviations, or selfies. It simply read, "Merry Christmas." That humble two-word phrase kicked off the era of mobile communication that would eventually ruin our attention spans and destroy proper grammar forever. It is fitting that the technology we use to ignore our families at the dinner table started with a polite wish for a happy holiday. 33. You might think Jingle Bells is just an annoying song you hear in malls, but it holds the prestigious title of being the soundtrack to the first ever musical performance in outer space, and it actually started as a terrifying prank. On December 16, 1965, the astronauts aboard Gemini 6 radioed Mission Control with a grave, serious report about a mysterious UFO they had spotted in polar orbit. They described a large vehicle entering the atmosphere, commanded by a pilot wearing a red suit, causing NASA engineers on the ground to genuinely panic about a potential alien encounter or a secret Soviet weapon. Just as the tension peaked, the astronauts whipped out a smuggled miniature harmonica and a set of bells to play a shaky version of Jingle Bells over the radio. It proves that even when humanity leaves the planet to explore the deadly vacuum of space, we still can't resist the urge to make terrible dad jokes about Santa Claus. We just proved that our ancestors were completely insane, but I guarantee we missed something. I want you to expose your own culture in the comments. What is the single weirdest or most embarrassing holiday tradition from your country that deserves to be number 34? Shock me with your local madness. Smash that like button if you learned something disturbing, and subscribe for more history that ruins your childhood.